Last night on EA.com, there was a new Mass Effect Legendary Edition blog post. This one's going over the visual improvements that we can expect to see in Mass Effect Legendary Edition. In addition to this, there's also a new trailer showing off some of these visual improvements in action. And honestly, as far as remasters go, this one looks pretty terrific. And so I thought we'd spend this video going over the visual improvements that have been detailed in this blog. And then of course the trailer's there for the sake of seeing being believing. But let's dive straight into this video, shall we? The blog post opens to rehash their already known goal from the onset, which is to improve and enhance the visuals while staying true to the original aesthetics of the trilogy that have become so iconic and genre-defining over the past decade, and that this remaster rather than a remake allowed BioWare to build upon the original assets in a way that resembles the polishing phase in a normal development cycle, while also being able to utilise the advantages of much more modern hardware and software. What's quite reassuring is, before they go into any of the information, they do address something that a lot of people when remastering games don't necessarily talk about, which is that changing almost any asset or system can and will break something else. And when a game's in its final state, it generally resembles a house of cards, and so anything as simple as blowing the dust off, let alone implementing fundamental changes like updating the version of the engine, will undoubtedly cause unexpected problems. That's their words, not mine, and honestly, I kind of respect them saying that, because a lot of remasters have these problems where it's clear that they've done something that's caused a glitch that you didn't experience in the original, and that thing could be quite game breaking. One massive example I think is in Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered. Every time you synchronize at a viewpoint, the synchronization music will play until you restart the game, and that's nowhere near as comprehensive a remaster as the Mass Effect Legendary Edition appears to be. And so the point is, it doesn't take much to destabilize a game altogether, whether that be a big problem or a small one. It's good that BioWare and EA are addressing this outright, which likely means that they've been mindful of it the entire development of this remaster, and so it's quite reassuring to see it mentioned in the blog post. They go on to say that remastering games is a deceivingly complex process, so they needed a proper plan for how best to mitigate risk while reopening 3 games to full development, and so the blog gets broken down into 3 parts, which details their 3-phased approach to the remaster of the trilogy, which is Phase 1, building the foundation, Phase 2, modernization efforts, and Phase 3 being rebuilding worlds. Apparently they started Phase 1 by identifying and cataloguing every single asset in the trilogy. That sounds tedious as fuck. I hope they're okay. They needed to find out how many particle effects, 3D models, textures, levels, graphical user interface elements, sounds, cinematic movies, etc. actually exist across the trilogy. Do the content creation files or source assets still exist? What percentage of those assets need improving? On an average, how long will each asset type take to improve? Since the original trilogy was released entirely on a console cycle that allowed up to 1080p resolutions, but was often actually running at 720p or lower, now the remaster is releasing on hardware that allows 4K resolutions, so the answer for how many textures they needed to improve was very easy. Every single one of them. Apparently for the entire trilogy, that's well over 30,000 individual textures, which just strikes me as a madness. So first they increased the engine limits on texture sizes, so any textures that were authored larger than could be used on disk could now use their full resolutions. They then wrote some batch processes that worked along with an AI up-resolution program to increase the original uncompressed textures to 4 times their originally authored sizes. There is a joke to be made about the use of AI in the development of a Mass Effect game, even if it is only a remaster, but I think I'm going to leave that for somebody more calibrated to that kind of humour. Apparently the batch tools made special considerations to maintain the validity of special texture types, like normal maps or masks, to ensure colours don't contaminate each other. This section goes on to say that they also incorporated some more modern texture compression techniques that would allow those textures to hold on to more of their quality on disk. Meanwhile, their programmers were hard at work upgrading their version of the Unreal 3 engine to a more updated and unified version, with the game playable again and a much higher base resolution to work from. And that's where they began to improve assets by hand. There's a nice picture here comparing the original Mass Effect 1 Anderson to the remastered Mass Effect 1 Anderson, and you can certainly see the improved textures and resolutions. Phase 2 goes over the modernization efforts. Wait, hang on, I love these things. I'm sorry, the inner child within me just sort of goes mad. To summarise this first paragraph, Phase 2 was the beginning of full-scale development essentially, and they started off where they knew the biggest improvements were needed, which was Mass Effect 1. Some assets such as characters and generic props were shared between the games, and many had already been improved in later title or DLC. For those cases, they generally used the improved asset as the base and improved it further, then ported it across the whole trilogy, which resulted in more consistent and higher quality assets, but they had to carefully ensure this process didn't flatten the sense of passage of time and the overall narrative. For recurring characters who appeared in all three games, they maintained slight changes throughout the trilogy as they aged, matured, or got hit by a rocket. Poor Garrus, man. And obviously they couldn't allow uniforms branded with SR2 sneak their way back onto the crew of the SR1, and they liked how the Alliance Admiralty uniforms became more militarized and sleek as the trilogy progressed, so they improved each version of those outfits individually. Character artists worked their way through a prioritized list of hundreds of armors, creatures, characters, guns, and vehicles across the whole trilogy. They would frequently take an asset back to its original high-poly sculpt, focus on achieving a consistent texture resolution, add supporting 3D geometry where needed, and fix errors with baked normal maps or texture mapping. Central to their efforts was increasing a sense of realism in the surface response. While the games don't use physically based rendering, they could still work with the textures and materials to ensure plastics, fabrics, and metals reacted to light in a more convincing way. Similarly, they dedicated a significant amount of time to improving skin, hair, and eye shaders across the trilogy. Their tech animators then reskinned each improved mesh and imported it back into each game as needed. The particle effects artists extended the length and smoothness of animations for things like smoke and fire, while also adding in more secondary emitters to beef up the overall look for each effect. A fire might now have secondary smoke trails and sparks, explosions fling chunks of rubble, and the muzzle flash on your weapons now subtly illuminates Shepard and their surroundings. For the smoke effects mentioned, we can see some of those in action in the comparison trailer that was released, but these improved material and particle effects are going to definitely add atmosphere where they're present, as it just gives a more detailed, layered look. New environmental particle effects were added throughout the trilogy to better enhance the mood and a space's sense of life. I think this will mostly see improvement in areas in Mass Effect 1 where you just dropped on a planet with the Mako, and it can be quite basic at times. There may be some hazards and stuff, but honestly these places can look a little raw. As many have already noticed, they also sharpened up and added secondary elements to the trilogy's iconic horizontal lens flares. And I suppose that's what this shot of the Mako really shows off, that horizontal lens flare and the rest of the improvements with it, but mostly the horizontal lens flare. Moving on in 4K, smooth flowing lines that once only took up a few hundred pixels on a screen now expanded across thousands or tens of thousands of them, and so they had to completely rebuild many elements from the vector images to achieve needed clarity and crispness, while other images could be run through secondary non-automated AI processes to sharpen and clean up artifacts. More interestingly, perhaps, cinematics across the trilogy have been improved whenever possible. They completely re-rendered the pre-rendered cutscenes in 4K. When it was not possible to recapture, they utilized an AI upscale program on the original uncompressed videos in both workflows. They tweaked the color correction, added additional details and visual effects, and even smoothed out some edges frame by frame so they didn't feel dated when compared to actual gameplay. In the process, they've fixed dozens, if not hundreds, of bugs that occurred in live-action cutscenes and conversations. Apparently, the head-spinning meme still exists if you know how to look for it, and I suppose some bugs aren't meant to be removed, they're meant to be cherished and enjoyed. Also during this phase, environment artists completed passes through each level of the trilogy, performing targeted fixes on any asset or location that visually detracted from the overall experience. This included adding props to exceptionally barren areas, which is a very common issue in Mass Effect 1 for sure, remaking low-resolution or stretched textures, smoothing out jagged 3D assets, and modernizing shaders on surfaces with poor lighting response. At this point, they also began resolving hundreds of bugs, from minor things like floating assets to major game-breaking collision issues, including a very frequent global issue where players could easily teleport on top of assets and become completely stuck, which was a huge problem in Mass Effect 2. In fact, it was so reliably easy to trigger that speedrunners started using it to their advantage when they did runs. But in certain scenarios where the terrain is somewhat diagonal, it would often trigger on its own and leave you just stuck in the air. I suppose it's good that it's fixed, but speedrunners won't necessarily be best pleased. In the Phase 2 segment, it goes on to say that lighting designers followed closely behind the level artists, ensuring that all of the beautified environments and characters were always shown in their best light. Mass Effect's specific lighting style features high contrast spotlights and a heavy use of complementary colours. That style was refined heavily throughout the trilogy, so they were able to bring many of those improvements back into the first game, focusing on maintaining that high contrast look while adding natural bounce to lighting to ensure characters are lit more consistently and beautifully. And that's fair enough. The lighting in Mass Effect 1 especially could see room for improvement for sure, and the remaster seems to be addressing that, but at the same time it does help in establishing the atmosphere for the lighting to keep its high contrast. And so I think it is important that a balance is found there, and by the sounds of it and what we've seen, it does appear as if that is the case. This segment finishes up by saying players will have more opportunities to see their improved characters reflected in-game, as the trilogy also includes new real-time reflections. Here they link an IGN video which shows the reflection in the Normandy fish tank, which of course is very cool. Real-time reflections are nice, we all love them. And then that brings us to Phase 3, which is titled Rebuilding Worlds, in which they began to look at opportunities to make broader improvements to levels and features rather than just updating the individual assets. And how they did this is they essentially compared the levels they shipped in the original game to the concept art for that game, and also took dozens of screenshots from the currently up-res levels and sent them over to Derek Watts, the original Mass Effect trilogy's art director, who used them as a base for new concept art, which were paintovers, so it was based on these screenshots and then improved from there. They gave a few examples for the visual improvements made, so here they are. Ferris had a few visually distinct sections, including the colony and the highway that leads to the Exogeny Corporation building, the aqueducts and the Thorian layer. The former of these now features stronger smoke and fire effects, more buildings to fill out the skybox, and much more damage and debris to better showcase the attack by the Geth. They leaned into the visual atmosphere of the creepy dark interiors with directional light shafts guiding players to uncover the mysteries of the Thorian that sounds creepier than ever thanks to the new audio mix. And thanks to the screenshot here, we know the improvements are going to be night and day. Lighting in Novaria has been reworked throughout the level, the storm outside has been intensified, and they've accentuated the differences between the hotel area and the Synthetic Insights lab to hopefully improve your ability to navigate the mission's early sections. I'll be honest, the early sections of Novaria and Mass Effect 1 always came across as something of a concrete jungle, and it could be quite confusing to navigate at first, so anything that helps there is more than welcome. But again, the visual improvements in the comparison screenshot is, like I said, night and day. There's also a shot of Ashley on Eden Prime which shows some serious improvements, though people have quickly pointed out that the sky is no longer as red as it was. Obviously this is to line up more with the From Ashes DLC for Mass Effect 3, in which we see Eden Prime as the verdant paradise it's described as. But the good news is they haven't got rid of the oppressive red sky altogether, as they've moved the sun's placement so the player's path forward is now illuminated by evening light while the burnt red sky looms behind, punctuated with falling ash and tracer fire. They also improved the planet's surface with additional fire and battle damage, more foliage and destroyed structures littering the crater Sovereign leaves behind. Basically, they're making Eden Prime look more like how it's described rather than a colony that was set up 5 minutes before it was attacked at the beginning of Mass Effect 1. Obviously in Phase 3 is where they implemented the quality of life changes that they detailed in the previous blog that we actually did a video on, which will be linked at the very end if you're curious. But that more or less brings us to the end of the blog post. There is a little send-off chapter, but that's it otherwise. It's one thing reading all the details and seeing the odd screenshot, and it's one thing seeing the trailer, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how this game plays all together when it launches on the 14th of May, which is just a month out now. It's good to read about all the information regarding this remaster, and it's also good to see the improvements that are being made. It's really clear that this is not going to be a half-assed remaster, as we're aware of improvements that have been made to both the visual quality, the audio quality, and the gameplay itself to enhance and modernise one of the best trilogy experiences in gaming, in my opinion. So it'll be a brilliant time to dive in for those wanting to do their first playthrough, but it will also be the perfect excuse to revisit the Mass Effect trilogy for those of us who have played these games far too many times to be happy to say it out loud. But of course that does bring us to the end of this video. Of course I will link both the blog post and the trailer that released down in the description. Thank you all for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff, that would be super fantastic. And with any luck I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, take care and goodbye.